A 72-year-old farmer was dragged from the only land his family had owned for 3 generations. The banker said the debt was legal. The sheriff said the papers were final. The whole town lowered their eyes as Amos Whitaker stood in the mud, clutching an old family Bible to his chest, watching strangers nail an auction notice to his porch. But when a retired marshal opened that Bible and found a hidden page between the births and the burials, a secret buried for 40 years began to rise from the dust. A secret that could expose a stolen deed, a false debt, and a betrayal so deep it would shake the entire county. This is the story of an elderly farmer who lost everything, until one forgotten Bible proved the land had never truly belonged to the men who took it. The morning Amos Whitaker lost his farm began with frost on the wheat and silence in the house. The sun had barely climbed over the eastern ridge when the old farmer stepped onto his porch with a tin cup of coffee in one hand and his late wife's family Bible tucked beneath the other arm. The fields beyond the house lay pale beneath the early cold, each row silvered with ice, each fence post glowing faintly in the weak light. Whitaker Farm had always looked most beautiful before the world woke up. That was what his wife Mary used to say. Before wagons rattled, before men argued, before papers and debts and courthouse seals turned God's earth into something that could be measured, threatened, and stolen, Amos stood there for a long time, listening to the land. At 72, his hearing was not as sharp as it had once been, but he still knew the voice of his own farm, the wind through the wheat, the soft creak of the barn door, the distant lowing of cattle near the creek, the old house settling around him like a tired friend. His grandfather had broken this ground with oxen. His father had built the first stone well. Amos had raised 3 children here, buried 2, and laid Mary to rest beneath the cottonwood on the hill. Every scar on his hands belonged to this soil. Every prayer he had ever said had risen from it. Yet by noon, the bank intended to take it away. He looked down at the Bible in his arm. The cover was cracked black leather, worn smooth at the corners by generations of hands. Inside were names written in brown ink. Births, marriages, deaths, promises, losses. Mary had kept it near her bed until the day she died. When men forget who they are, she once told him, "Open this book and remember who came before you." Amos had opened it many times since her passing, but remembering did not stop debt notices. Remembering did not soften the banker. Remembering did not change the fact that drought had ruined 2 harvests, cattle fever had taken half his herd, and a loan he believed was nearly paid had somehow grown teeth in the hands of a man named Silas Crow. The first wagon arrived just after breakfast. Amos saw it come through the front gate without slowing, iron-rimmed wheels crunching over frozen ruts. Behind it came a second wagon, then 2 riders. On the lead wagon sat Silas Crow himself, president of Crow County Bank, dressed in a dark wool coat that looked too clean for farm roads. His face was narrow, his mustache carefully trimmed, his gloved hands folded over a polished cane. Beside him sat Sheriff Dalton Price, a broad man with a heavy jaw and the uncomfortable look of someone who had chosen duty because it was easier than choosing conscience. Behind them rode a young deputy and 2 hired men from town. Amos set his coffee down on the porch rail. He did not move when the wagon stopped. Silas Crow climbed down first, adjusted his coat, and looked at the farm as though he were inspecting property already arranged in his mind. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker," he said. Amos stared at him. It was. The sheriff removed his hat. Amos. Dalton. The old farmer's voice carried no anger yet, only tiredness. Crow stepped forward, holding a folded document. "We have delayed this matter as long as the bank can reasonably allow." Amos looked past him toward the wheat fields. Reasonably, Crow's mouth tightened. "The debt remains unpaid." "The debt was paid twice over in interest before you bought the note. That is not what the records show." Amos finally looked at him. "Records can lie when liars hold the pen." The hired men shifted uneasily. Sheriff Price looked away. Crow smiled thinly. "I understand this is painful, but sentiment has no standing against signed obligation." He handed the document to the sheriff, who unfolded it with visible reluctance. "By court order," Price said quietly, "Whitaker Farm and all attached acreage are hereby seized pending public auction to satisfy outstanding debt owed to Crow County Bank." The words fell flat in the cold air. Amos felt them, but not as surprise. He had known this moment was coming. He had imagined it during sleepless nights, while the roof creaked above him and Mary's empty chair stood beside the stove. Still, hearing the law speak through a man he had watched grow from a boy into a sheriff made something in him bend almost to breaking. "You know this is wrong," Amos said. Price's jaw worked. "I know there's a court order. That is not what I asked." The sheriff had no answer. Crow turned to the hired men. "Post the notice." One man walked toward the porch with a hammer and a paper placard. Amos stepped in front of him. The hired man stopped. "Move, Mr. Whitaker," Crow said. Amos tightened his hold on the Bible. "This house has had Whitaker blood in its boards longer than your bank has had a name, and yet names do not pay debts. Neither do forged numbers." Crow's eyes flashed. "Be careful." "I have been careful for 72 years. Look where it got me." The sheriff stepped closer. "Amos, don't make this harder." The old farmer looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment Sheriff Price seemed smaller than his badge. Harder for who? No one answered. The hired man moved again. Amos did not strike him. He did not shout. He simply stood, until the young deputy touched his arm. "Sir." The touch was gentle, but it was enough. Amos looked down at the boy's hand on his sleeve, then at the sheriff, then at the banker waiting with clean boots in his yard. Slowly, painfully, he stepped aside. The hammer rose. The first nail bit into the porch post. Each strike sounded louder than the last. Auction notice. Property seized. By order of the court. Amos stared at the paper while the cold moved through his coat and into his bones. He had survived war rumors, drought, locusts, sickness, burying children, burying Mary. But watching his home reduced to ink and nails felt like a death he had not prepared for. By late morning, word had spread into town. A few neighbors appeared along the road but did not come through the gate. Some stood beside wagons, faces lowered. Others whispered behind gloved hands. Amos recognized them all. Men he had lent seed to. Women Mary had nursed through fever. Families who had shared harvest suppers under his cottonwoods. None stepped forward. Not because they hated him, because fear of the bank had made cowards of decent people. Silas Crow noticed the gathering and raised his voice slightly, making certain everyone could hear. "Mr. Whitaker will be allowed until sundown to remove personal belongings from the house. Livestock and equipment attached to the property are included in seizure." Amos turned sharply. "My mule is not attached to your paper. Any working animal listed under farm collateral is included. That mule is 26 years old." Crow shrugged. "Then perhaps sentiment will purchase him at auction." Something dark passed across Amos's face, but before he could speak, another voice came from beyond the gate. "Silas, you always did know how to make a lawful thing smell rotten." Every head turned. A gray horse stood near the road, and on it sat Gideon Hale, retired U.S. Marshal, 65 years old, lean as fence wire, with a weathered face, pale blue eyes, and a long brown duster faded by years of sun and dust. He had arrived in Cedar Hollow 3 years earlier and had kept mostly to himself ever since, living in a small cabin beyond the blacksmith shop. Folks said he had once tracked killers across 3 territories. Others said he had retired after a shootout that left him with a limp and a hatred for courthouse lies. Amos knew only that Gideon had brought Mary flowers after the funeral without saying a word, then fixed the broken latch on her garden gate before leaving. Crow's expression hardened. "Marshal Hale, this is a civil matter." Gideon dismounted slowly. His right leg stiffened when it touched the ground, but his eyes remained sharp. "Retired Marshal, then it does not concern you. Most wrong things say that when a witness arrives." Sheriff Price nodded uneasily. "Gideon." "Dalton." Hale walked through the gate, studying the notice, the wagons, the hired men, then Amos. His gaze paused on the Bible in the old farmer's arm. "You all right?" Amos gave a faint, broken laugh. "I've been better." Gideon looked at the banker. "How much does he owe?" Crow smiled. "The amount is clearly stated in the court filing. That was not what I asked." For the second time that morning, someone had used Amos's own words against the men taking his farm. A murmur passed among the neighbors near the road. Crow's face tightened. Including principal, interest, penalties, filing fees, and transfer charges, Mr. Whitaker owes $843. Amos stared at him. My original loan was $120. Gideon looked toward the sheriff. That sound right to you? Price shifted his weight. I'm here to serve an order, not audit a bank. Convenient. Crow stepped closer. You are interfering. Gideon's voice remained calm. No, I am listening. He turned to Amos. You have your papers? Amos's shoulders sagged. Had them in a tin box. Fire took half the records 5 years ago. Any family deed? Amos shook his head. County office has the deed. Crow smiled again. Too quickly. Gideon noticed. Does it? The banker said nothing. Amos looked down at the Bible. Mary always said the first land promise was written somewhere in here. I never found it. Gideon's attention sharpened. May I see it? Amos hesitated. The Bible was not a document to him. It was Mary. It was his mother. It was every Whitaker who had crossed the plains, broken sod, buried kin, and refused to leave. But something in Gideon Hale's voice was not curiosity. It was respect. Slowly, Amos handed it over. Gideon removed his gloves before touching the book. That small act made Amos's throat tighten. The retired marshal carried the Bible to the porch rail and opened it carefully. Pages whispered in the cold wind. Births, marriages, deaths, a pressed violet from Mary's wedding bouquet, a lock of baby hair tied with thread. Gideon turned each page slowly, his expression unreadable. Crow watched with visible irritation. This is sentimental nonsense. Gideon did not look up. Then it should not worry you. He reached the family record pages near the center. The paper there was thicker, older. Names had been written over several generations. Then his thumb paused. Along the inner binding, near the page listing Amos's grandfather's marriage, a sliver of folded parchment protruded where age had loosened the stitching. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He gently worked it free. Amos leaned forward. Crow stopped smiling. The parchment was small, brittle, and folded twice. Gideon opened it with the care of a man disarming a pistol. Written across the top in faded ink were the words, Land Covenant, Whitaker Claim, 1,849. The neighbors near the road fell silent. Amos stared without breathing. Gideon read the first lines, then looked sharply at Crow. Well now. The banker took one step forward. That paper has no standing. Gideon turned the parchment so the sheriff could see the seal at the bottom. You sure about that? Sheriff Price's face drained of color. Is that the territorial seal? Gideon nodded. And a witness signature. Amos whispered, What does it say? The retired marshal looked at him, and for the first time that morning something like hope entered his eyes. It says your grandfather's claim was protected under a covenant separate from the county deed. It says this land could not be transferred, seized, or auctioned for private debt unless all living Whitaker heirs signed release. The cold seemed to vanish from Amos's body. I never signed any release. Gideon looked back at Crow. No, I expect you didn't. Crow's face hardened into something ugly. An old scrap found in a Bible changes nothing today. Gideon folded the parchment carefully. Maybe not today. He slipped it back between the Bible pages and closed the book. But it changes enough for me to ask why the county deed office never mentioned it. The sheriff looked toward the banker. Crow looked toward the hired men. The neighbors along the road began whispering, but this time the sound was different, less afraid, more awake. Amos took the Bible back with trembling hands. For the first time since sunrise, he held it not only as memory but as evidence. Gideon stepped beside him, facing the banker and sheriff. Silas, I think this auction ought to wait. Crow's eyes burned. You have no authority. The old marshal smiled without warmth. Retired, not dead. And as the winter sun climbed higher over Whitaker Farm, the auction notice still nailed to the porch post, Amos realized the land beneath his boots had begun to speak for itself. But across the yard, Silas Crow stared at the family Bible with the look of a man who had just seen a grave open. and that meant the paper hidden inside was only the first secret. The news traveled through Cedar Hollow faster than a prairie fire driven by summer wind. Before noon, every merchant on Main Street, every ranch hand at the livery stable, every churchwoman hanging laundry behind her home, and every gambler sitting in Murphy's saloon had heard the same unbelievable rumor. Amos Whitaker's family Bible contained a document older than the county itself, a document that might stop the auction of Whitaker Farm. Some people called it a miracle. Others called it nonsense. But everyone was talking. Amos sat on the porch beneath the auction notice, staring at the Bible resting in his lap. For years he had opened it, only to remember the dead. Now he found himself wondering how many secrets the living had overlooked. Across the yard, Gideon Hale leaned against the fence rail, studying the distant road. The retired marshal had barely spoken since discovering the covenant. That worried Amos more than if he had talked constantly. Men like Gideon thought before they moved. They measured danger before naming it. And if he was silent, it meant he had already seen trouble approaching. Sheriff Dalton Price remained nearby as well. Officially, he was waiting for instructions from the county judge. Unofficially, he seemed unwilling to leave the old farmer alone with Crow County Bank circling like a hungry wolf. The sheriff stood beside the gate, hat low over his eyes, watching townsfolk gather in small groups beyond the fence. Nobody crossed onto the property. Not yet. Fear still held them back. Silas Crow had returned to town after the discovery, but not before leaving 2 hired men to watch the farm. They stood beside their wagon under a cottonwood tree, pretending to be patient. Gideon knew better. Men paid to wait, usually waited for orders. Around mid-afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared on the southern road despite the winter cold. Amos noticed it first. Company. Gideon followed his gaze. A dark carriage approached quickly. Not a farm wagon. Not a supply wagon. Something expensive. The retired marshal's expression hardened. That didn't take long. The carriage rolled through the open gate without asking permission. 2 black horses pulled it. Brass fittings gleamed in the pale sunlight. A family crest decorated the door. Amos recognized it immediately. Harold Beaumont. Gideon nodded. Harold Beaumont owned more land than anyone within 50 miles. Banker, investor, cattle baron, and unofficial kingmaker of Cedar Hollow. If Silas Crow was the hand squeezing the farm, Harold Beaumont was often the mind behind the hand. The carriage stopped near the porch. A servant opened the door. Beaumont stepped out wearing a dark wool overcoat lined with fur. He was nearly 60, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and carried himself like a man accustomed to obedience. He glanced at the auction notice, then at Amos, then at the Bible. "Interesting afternoon," he said. Amos remained seated. "Depends who you ask." Beaumont smiled politely. "I hear you found something unexpected." Gideon stepped forward before Amos could answer. Word travels fast. Success always attracts attention. "This isn't success. Not yet." Beaumont's eyes lingered on the Bible. "May I see it?" "No." The answer came from Gideon instantly. Beaumont chuckled. "You always were direct, Marshal." "Retired Marshal. Still suspicious, I see. Suspicion keeps old men alive." Beaumont ignored him and addressed Amos instead. "I knew your father." Amos said nothing. Good man. Honest. Hard-working. He would hate to see this farm become the center of unnecessary conflict. "Funny," Amos replied. "I imagine he'd hate losing it even more." Beaumont's smile faded slightly. "Perhaps." He climbed the porch steps without invitation. Sheriff Price straightened, but did not interfere. The powerful ranch owner stopped within arm's reach of Amos. "Listen carefully. Old documents create confusion. Lawyers create expense. Courts create delays. Sometimes a simple agreement serves everyone better." Amos finally looked up. "What agreement?" Beaumont removed a folded paper from his coat. "Crow County Bank is prepared to forgive a substantial portion of your debt." Gideon laughed. Not loudly, not kindly. Beaumont ignored him. "In exchange, you voluntarily surrender any claim arising from the covenant document." Silence settled across the porch. Even the hired men beneath the tree seemed interested. Amos stared at the paper. "You're offering me money to forget what was inside my Bible. I am offering peace. You're offering fear." Beaumont's jaw tightened. Be careful, Amos. Why? Because some battles leave people worse off than before. Gideon stepped beside the rocking chair. Sounds almost like a threat. Beaumont looked at him coldly. Sounds like advice. The two men held each other's gaze for several seconds. Amos suddenly understood something important. Harold Beaumont had not driven all the way from his ranch because he cared about an old farmer. He had come because the covenant frightened him. The realization settled heavily inside Amos. If powerful men feared a piece of paper hidden for 40 years, perhaps that paper mattered far more than anyone realized. Beaumont eventually returned the folded offer to his pocket. Think about it. He turned toward the carriage. This county survives because reasonable men choose stability over chaos. Gideon's voice followed him. Funny thing about stability. Beaumont paused. What's that? What? It usually depends on the truth staying buried. The ranch owner climbed into the carriage without answering. Moments later, he disappeared down the road. Nobody spoke until the dust settled. Then Sheriff Price exhaled slowly. I don't like this. Gideon nodded. Neither do I. Amos tightened his grip on the Bible. What aren't you telling me? The retired marshal studied the horizon before answering. Harold Beaumont doesn't involve himself in small matters. If he came personally, then this covenant threatened something larger than a farm. Amos looked down at the old leather cover. Such as? I don't know yet. Gideon glanced toward the road. But I intend to find out. Late that afternoon, they gathered around Amos's kitchen table. The family Bible lay open beneath a lantern. Sheriff Price remained, despite claiming he should leave. Gideon took that as a good sign. Men wrestling with conscience often lingered near truth longer than expected. The covenant parchment rested carefully beside the Bible. Gideon read every line again, then again. The wording remained difficult. Territorial legal language. Old claims. Boundary protections. Special conditions. Most of it sounded meaningless, until one sentence caught his attention. He leaned closer. There. Amos frowned. What? Gideon pointed. All land granted under covenant shall remain protected according to the original survey attached to witness registry. Sheriff Price scratched his chin. Survey attached where? Exactly. Gideon sat back. This document refers to another document. Amos sighed. Wonderful. No. Useful. Gideon tapped the parchment. If there's a survey, then there's a witness registry. If there's a witness registry, then someone recorded this officially. The sheriff nodded slowly. County archives. Or territorial archives. Amos stared at the fading sunlight beyond the window. And if the records disappeared? Gideon looked at him. Then someone made them disappear. That possibility darkened the room. Evening arrived quickly. The temperature dropped. Wind rattled the shutters. Amos lit another lamp while Gideon reviewed notes. Sheriff Price finally stood. I'll check the courthouse tomorrow. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Officially? Officially, I'm making sure nobody violates procedure. Unofficially? The sheriff hesitated. Unofficially, I want to know why I've spent 10 years enforcing laws that might have been built on lies. After he left, darkness settled over Whitaker Farm. Amos and Gideon remained at the kitchen table. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Amos opened the Bible again. He turned pages carefully. Birth records, marriage records, death records, family notes, recipes, prayers, pressed flowers, memories. Near midnight, something slipped loose from the back cover. A small folded scrap fluttered onto the table. Both men froze. Amos picked it up. The paper was newer than the covenant, but still old. Written across the front in faded ink were 3 words, for Gideon Hale only. Amos looked up sharply. Gideon's face had gone pale. You know this handwriting? The retired marshal nodded slowly. Mary Whitaker. The room suddenly felt smaller. Amos unfolded the note carefully. The message contained only one sentence. If anything happens to me, ask Reverend Thomas Walker about the second registry. Silence followed. Gideon stared at the note as though he had seen a ghost. Amos swallowed hard. Who's Reverend Walker? The retired marshal looked toward the darkness outside. A preacher. Where? Gideon's eyes remained fixed on the window. Dead. Amos felt the cold creep through the room. Then we're too late. Gideon shook his head. Maybe. He tapped the note. Or maybe Mary knew something before she died. Amos looked down at the words written by his wife years earlier. Suddenly the Bible seemed heavier than ever, not because it carried memories, because it carried clues. And somewhere beyond Cedar Hollow, hidden beneath decades of silence, another registry waited. A second piece of evidence. A second secret, one important enough for Mary Whitaker to hide inside the family Bible and trust that someday someone would find it. Outside, beyond the fields and beyond the dark roads of the county, men like Harold Beaumont were already moving to stop that from happening. Dawn arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds that seemed determined to press the entire county into silence. Amos Whitaker had barely slept. The note hidden inside the family Bible sat beside his bed all night, its short message haunting him more than any debt notice ever had. If anything happens to me, ask Reverend Thomas Walker about the second registry. The words had been written in Mary's careful hand years before her death, and the longer Amos stared at them, the more certain he became that his wife had known far more about the farm's history than she had ever revealed. The realization brought both comfort and sorrow. Even gone, Mary was still trying to protect him, still trying to save the land. He dressed before sunrise and found Gideon Hale already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a county map spread before him. The retired marshal looked as though he had spent the entire night thinking. Amos suspected he had. "You planning a war?" the old farmer asked. Gideon glanced up. "Maybe." Amos sat across from him. "Against who?" "Depends what we find." He tapped a finger against the map. "I spent half the night remembering Reverend Thomas Walker." Amos poured himself coffee. "You knew him?" Gideon nodded. "Everyone knew him once. He rode circuit churches across 3 counties before settling near Black Creek." "You trust him?" Gideon's expression darkened slightly. "Trusted him." Amos waited. "Walker died 12 years ago. You said that last night, and I remembered something else." Gideon leaned back. "The church where he preached burned down 6 months after his funeral." Amos frowned. "Accident?" "Officially." The room fell silent. Neither man believed in coincidences anymore. Not after the covenant. Not after Beaumont's visit. Not after Mary's note. Gideon folded the map. If Walker knew about a second registry, there's a chance he hid it somewhere before he died. Amos looked toward the Bible resting on the counter. "And you think somebody burned his church to erase it?" "I think powerful men spend money protecting secrets." Before Amos could respond, hoofbeats sounded outside. Sheriff Dalton Price rode into the yard alone. The sheriff dismounted quickly and walked toward the porch with an expression that told Gideon everything he needed to know. "Bad news?" the marshal asked. "Depends how much you enjoy corruption." Gideon gestured toward the chair. "Sit." Dalton remained standing. "County archives are missing." Amos felt his stomach sink. Missing? The territorial records from 1848 through 1853 disappeared years ago. Gideon narrowed his eyes. "Disappeared how?" Dalton laughed bitterly. "According to the official report, a flood damaged the basement. And according to the unofficial report," Dalton looked directly at him. "There is no flood report." Silence filled the room. Amos slowly set down his coffee cup. "Someone stole them." The sheriff nodded. "That's my guess." Gideon stood. "Who controlled the archives?" Dalton hesitated. "The county board." "And who chaired the county board 20 years ago?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Amos already knew. Harold Beaumont. Gideon swore softly. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, and none of them pointed anywhere good. Dalton pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "There's more." He handed it to Gideon. The retired marshal scanned the page. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Amos asked. Gideon looked up. Auction moved up. "What?" Dalton nodded grimly. "Originally scheduled for next week. Now it's tomorrow morning." Amos stared at him. "They can't do that." "Apparently they can." Gideon tossed the paper onto the table. They're scared. Dalton nodded. Exactly. The marshal paced across the room. Crow, Beaumont, whoever else is involved, they want the land sold before we find the second registry. Amos felt the walls closing around him. For a brief moment, the hope created by the covenant seemed to vanish. Tomorrow morning, less than 24 hours. Not enough time to uncover 40 years of buried secrets. Not enough time to save a farm. Gideon seemed to read his thoughts. Don't give up yet. Amos laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say. No, it isn't. The marshal stopped pacing. Because if we're right, then this stopped being about a farm a long time ago. Dalton leaned forward. What do you mean? Gideon spread the map across the table again. Think about it. A covenant hidden in a Bible. Missing county records. A dead preacher. A burned church. A second registry. Why go to all that trouble? Nobody answered. Gideon pointed toward several locations marked on the map. Because Whitaker Farm isn't the only property involved. Amos stared. What? The retired marshal traced a line across the county. The covenant references original territorial boundaries, not modern county boundaries. Dalton's eyes widened. You're saying, I'm saying if Beaumont buried those records, he may have stolen more than one farm. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Dangerous silence. Amos suddenly understood why Harold Beaumont had come personally, why the auction had been moved, why old records vanished, why Mary's note mattered. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined, far larger than Whitaker Farm. Then where do we look? Amos asked. Gideon pointed toward the northwest corner of the map. Black Creek. Dalton frowned. Walker's Church? The ruins. After 12 years? Gideon nodded. Mary specifically mentioned Walker. That means she believed something survived. Amos looked outside. Snow had begun falling again. Thick flakes drifted across the fields. The weather alone could make the trip dangerous. Yet doing nothing guaranteed defeat. Gideon folded the map. I'm leaving within the hour. Dalton stood immediately. I'll come. The marshal shook his head no. Why not? Because somebody needs to watch the auction preparations. Dalton clenched his jaw. You think they'll try something? Gideon smiled without humor. I think they've been trying something for 40 years. An hour later, Amos and Gideon rode north through falling snow. The old farmer hadn't traveled far from his land in years. Every mile seemed stranger than the last. Hills rolled beneath gray skies. Bare trees clawed at the wind. Frozen streams crossed the landscape like cracks in old glass. The farther they rode, the quieter the world became. By afternoon, Black Creek appeared beyond a ridge, or what remained of it. The town had nearly vanished. Half the buildings stood abandoned. The general store leaned sideways. The blacksmith shop had collapsed. Only a few families remained. Beyond the settlement sat the church ruins. Amos understood immediately why Gideon remembered them. Even burned, the structure carried a strange dignity. Stone walls still stood. Part of the bell tower remained. Charred beams reached toward the sky like blackened fingers. Snow covered everything. They dismounted at the edge of the property. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Amos noticed something strange. We're not alone. Gideon followed his gaze. Fresh horse tracks crossed the snow. Several sets. Recent. Very recent. The marshal's expression hardened instantly. Someone got here first. They moved carefully through the ruins. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Wind whispered through broken windows. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Then they found evidence. A shovel. Freshly disturbed earth. Broken stone. Amos felt his pulse quicken. Somebody's searching. Gideon crouched beside the hole. And they don't know exactly where to look. Hope flickered. If the searchers hadn't found the registry yet, perhaps there was still time. They entered what remained of the sanctuary. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof. Snow covered old pews. Burn marks scarred every wall. Amos could almost imagine the place as it once had been. Families praying, children singing, Reverend Walker preaching beneath candlelight. Then Gideon stopped. Look, near the altar stood a stone pedestal blackened by fire. Carved into its surface was a symbol, a small cross enclosed within a circle. Amos frowned. What is it? The marshal brushed snow away. More markings appeared beneath. Letters. Faded but visible. He read them slowly. Truth survives where fire cannot reach. Amos stared. That's a strange thing to carve into a church. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Unless it isn't a message, then what is it? The marshal stepped around the pedestal. Then he suddenly froze. Amos. What? Help me move this. Together, they pushed against the stone. It shifted slightly, more than it should have. Gideon's pulse quickened. The pedestal wasn't attached to the floor. It was covering something. They shoved harder. Stone scraped against stone. Finally, it slid aside. Beneath it lay a small iron door built into the foundation. Both men stared. Amos whispered, Dear God. Gideon knelt and brushed away decades of dirt. The iron handle remained intact. He pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. Cold air escaped from below. A hidden chamber. Darkness stretched beneath the church floor. Gideon raised his lantern. The light revealed stone steps descending into shadow. Amos felt excitement and fear collide inside him. After 40 years of lies, after missing records and burned buildings and hidden notes, they had finally found something real. Gideon looked into the darkness below. If Walker hid the second registry, he said quietly, this is where he did it. Then a gunshot exploded outside the church. Stone shattered beside the doorway. Both men dropped instantly. A second shot followed. And from somewhere beyond the ruins, a familiar voice shouted through the snow. You're too late, Marshal. The gunshot echoed through the burned church like thunder trapped inside a canyon. Stone exploded from the doorway as the bullet struck, sending fragments across the sanctuary floor. Amos Whitaker threw himself behind a fallen pew while Gideon Hale dropped beside the hidden chamber entrance. For several seconds, neither man moved. The wind howled through the shattered roof above them, carrying drifting snow into the ruins. Then the voice came again from outside. Calm. Confident. Dangerous. You should have stayed home, Marshal. Gideon recognized it instantly. Silas Crow. Amos felt his stomach twist. The banker himself had come all the way to Black Creek. That alone revealed how desperate the situation had become. Gideon slowly peeked over the broken stone wall. 3 riders stood beyond the churchyard. Crow sat atop a dark horse near the gate. Beside him were 2 armed men, Amos recognized from the bank. Neither looked particularly intelligent. Both looked willing to shoot. Gideon ducked back down. 3 of them. Amos tightened his grip on the Bible. 3 is enough. Not if they're stupid. Another bullet struck the outer wall. Dust drifted from the cracked stone ceiling. Crow's voice carried through the opening. You're chasing ghosts, Marshal. Gideon smiled grimly. Funny. That's usually what guilty men say. Silence followed. Then Crow laughed. You always were stubborn, and you always talk too much. Amos remained crouched beside the pew. His heart hammered inside his chest. At 72 years old, he had never expected to find himself trapped inside a burned church during a gunfight. Yet strangely, fear was no longer the strongest emotion inside him. Anger had taken its place. Anger at the lies. Anger at the theft. Anger at every man who believed an old farmer could simply be erased. Another shot cracked through the air. This one struck closer. Gideon glanced toward the hidden chamber beneath the floor. Can you climb? Amos frowned. Why? Because we're going down. Before Amos could argue, the marshal grabbed the lantern and descended the stone steps. There was no time for debate. The old farmer followed. Darkness swallowed them immediately. Gideon closed the iron hatch above their heads. The sound of wind and gunfire became distant. Lantern light revealed a narrow underground corridor lined with stone walls. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The air smelled old, very old. Amos stared in amazement. How long has this been here? long enough to be forgotten. They moved carefully downward. The passage opened into a hidden chamber beneath the church foundation. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Most had collapsed from age. Old books, boxes, and bundles of papers lay scattered across the floor. Amos felt excitement surge through him. Dear God. Gideon slowly turned the lantern. Walker hid an archive. For a moment, both men simply stared. The room contained decades of records, church ledgers, baptism logs, marriage certificates, correspondence, maps, entire histories buried beneath stone and silence. Then Gideon's attention fixed on something near the far wall, a wooden cabinet. Unlike everything else, it remained locked. The marshal approached cautiously. Dust covered the surface, but a brass plaque remained visible. Reverend Thomas Walker. Amos felt a chill. The old preacher had hidden more than sermons. Gideon examined the lock. Stand back. He drew a revolver and struck the latch twice. The metal snapped. The cabinet opened. Inside sat several bundles of documents tied with faded ribbon. On top rested a leather journal. Gideon opened it carefully. The first page contained only a date. The 14th of March, 1871. Beneath it was a single sentence. If you are reading this, they finally came for the registry. Amos stared. He knew. Gideon turned the page. More entries followed. Detailed entries. Names. Dates. Transactions. Land transfers. Secret agreements. The deeper he read, the darker his expression became. Amos watched carefully. What is it? The marshal looked up. It's Beaumont. What about him? Gideon handed over the journal. Amos scanned the page. His hands began trembling almost immediately. Reverend Walker had recorded everything. Landowners pressured into signing documents they couldn't read. Property seized under false debts. Survey maps altered after original filings disappeared. Witnesses bribed. County officials paid. Entire farms stolen and transferred through shell companies controlled by Harold Beaumont and his associates. Amos felt sick. How many? Gideon pointed toward a list. 27 names filled the page. 27 families. 27 farms. 27 thefts. Whitaker Farm was merely one victim among many. The realization struck Amos harder than any gunshot. For years he had believed his suffering was personal, unique. Now he understood it was part of something larger. A machine built from greed. A machine that had devoured families for decades. Suddenly voices echoed above them. Gideon froze. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Multiple men moving through the church ruins overhead. Crow's men had entered the building. Amos gripped the journal tightly. They found the hatch. The marshal extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Both men listened. Boards creaked overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Then came Crow's voice. Much closer now. Search everything. Another man replied. What if they found it? Then kill them and bring me the registry. Amos felt cold anger settle inside him. Not fear. Not panic. Anger. After everything they had discovered, Crow wasn't even pretending anymore. Murder had become part of the plan. Gideon leaned close and whispered, "Look around." What? There might be another exit. They began searching by touch alone. Stone walls, broken shelves, crates, barrels. The darkness made every second feel longer. Above them, footsteps moved closer. Then Amos's hand brushed something unusual. Iron. A ring embedded in the floor. Gideon. The marshal moved beside him. Together they pulled. A hidden stone slab shifted. Cold air rushed upward. A tunnel. Gideon smiled faintly. Walker was smarter than I thought. Above them, someone shouted. The hatch had been found. Amos heard metal scraping against stone. Crow's men were opening it. Move. Gideon grabbed the journal and several document bundles. Amos tucked the family Bible beneath his arm. Then both men slipped into the tunnel below. Seconds later, voices exploded behind them. Lantern light flooded the chamber. Crow's men had arrived. "They're here!" someone shouted. "After them!" Gunfire erupted. Bullets ricocheted through the darkness. Stone chips flew past Amos's head. The tunnel sloped downward sharply. He nearly fell twice. Gideon stayed close, guiding him through the darkness. Behind them, pursuit continued. The tunnel stretched beneath Black Creek like a buried vein. At one point it widened enough to reveal old support beams. At another it narrowed so tightly Amos could barely squeeze through. Minutes felt like hours. Finally a pale glow appeared ahead. Daylight. Gideon pushed forward. They emerged from the hillside nearly half a mile beyond the church. Snow covered everything. The old marshal immediately turned and pulled loose a rotten support beam near the tunnel entrance. The ceiling collapsed behind them with a thunderous roar. Earth and stone sealed the passage. Silence returned. Both men stood gasping in the cold air. Amos looked back toward the distant church. Tiny figures moved around the ruins. Crow's men would eventually discover the tunnel collapse, but by then it would be too late. Gideon held up the journal. "We have them." Amos nodded slowly. For the first time since losing his farm, hope felt real. Not because of a covenant, not because of a hidden registry, because they now possessed proof, names, records, confessions, evidence strong enough to destroy powerful men. Yet Gideon did not smile. Amos noticed immediately. "What?" The marshal stared toward Cedar Hollow. "This journal proves the thefts. Then we win." Gideon shook his head. "Not yet, why not?" He opened the journal to the final page. Amos read the last sentence. His blood turned cold. The second registry was removed from Black Creek in 1874 and delivered to the courthouse vault beneath Cedar Hollow. Neither man spoke. The wind swept across the snow-covered hillside. They had risked everything to find the registry. Instead, they had discovered it was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere much closer. Somewhere directly beneath the courthouse, controlled by the very men trying to stop them. Gideon slowly closed the journal. "Tomorrow morning is the auction," Amos nodded, "and the registry is under the courthouse." The marshal looked toward Cedar Hollow in the distance. "Which means before they steal your farm," he tucked the journal inside his coat, "we're going to steal something back." The ride back to Cedar Hollow felt shorter than it should have. Perhaps it was because neither Amos Whitaker nor Gideon Hale spoke much during the journey. Each man carried enough thoughts to fill the silence. Snow drifted across the road behind them while the winter sky darkened toward evening. Inside, Gideon's coat rested Reverend Walker's journal and the stolen history of 27 families. Inside Amos's saddlebag rested the family Bible that had started everything. Between those two books lay enough truth to destroy some of the most powerful men in the county. Yet truth alone would not save Whitaker Farm by sunrise. The auction was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. Less than 14 hours remained. Amos knew it. Gideon knew it. And somewhere ahead of them, so did Harold Beaumont. By the time they reached the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, darkness had fallen completely. Lanterns glowed in windows across town. Wagons rattled along muddy streets. Smoke drifted from chimneys. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Yet Amos noticed people whispering whenever they passed. The entire county seemed to sense that something important was happening. They stopped first at Sheriff Dalton Price's office. The sheriff opened the door before they could knock. "You're alive." Gideon removed his hat. "Disappointed?" Dalton exhaled heavily. "You have any idea what kind of day I've had?" "Probably." The sheriff stepped aside. "Get in here." Inside the office, maps and documents covered nearly every surface. Dalton looked exhausted. He hadn't shaved. His coffee had gone cold. Several unopened telegrams lay scattered across the desk. Amos immediately recognized the look of a man caught between duty and conscience. "What's happened?" Gideon asked. Dalton closed the door behind them. "Harold Beaumont happened." Gideon nodded. "Explain." The sheriff grabbed one of the telegrams. 3 calls from county commissioners. 2 from Judge Carter. 1 from the state banking board. Amos frowned. "About the auction?" Dalton laughed bitterly. "About me." Gideon's expression hardened. "They're leaning on you. They're threatening me." The sheriff tossed the telegram onto the desk. "Apparently asking questions about missing records has made me unpopular." Gideon opened Walker's journal and slid it across the desk. "This should help." Dalton began reading. His expression changed almost immediately. By the 3rd page, his face had gone pale. By the 5th, he looked furious. By the 10th, he slammed the book shut. Son of a bitch. Nobody corrected him. The sheriff stood and paced across the room. 27 farms. He shook his head. 27 families. Amos stared at the floor. Hearing the number aloud somehow made it worse. Dalton stopped beside the window. Judge Carter needs to see this. Gideon remained calm. Can he be trusted? The sheriff hesitated. Maybe. That's not an answer. Dalton sighed. He's honest. Good. But he's scared of Beaumont. Gideon nodded. That's an answer. Silence settled over the room. Then Amos spoke. The registry. Both men turned toward him. Walker said it was moved beneath the courthouse. Dalton frowned. The vault? Gideon nodded. You know it? The sheriff's expression grew complicated. Everybody knows it. Explain. Dalton pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. The courthouse was built over the original Territorial Records vault. Most people think it's empty now. Gideon leaned forward. Most people? The basement is sealed. Who has access? Dalton laughed once. Officially? Nobody. Unofficially? Dalton met Gideon's eyes. Judge Carter, Harold Beaumont, and the county records clerk. Amos felt his pulse quicken. They finally had a location. Not certainty, but a location. Gideon stood. We're going tonight. Dalton stared at him. You're serious. Very. That's illegal. Gideon smiled faintly. So is stealing 27 farms. The sheriff rubbed his face. This is a terrible idea. Probably. I could lose my badge, maybe. Dalton sighed. And if Beaumont catches us? Gideon glanced toward the journal. Then at least we'll know we were right. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then the sheriff opened a drawer and removed a ring of keys. Amos blinked. Dalton tossed them onto the desk. I hate all of you. Gideon caught the keys. Good man. No. Dalton stood, just tired. Midnight arrived beneath freezing skies. Cedar Hollow slept, most of it anyway. Gideon, Amos, and Dalton moved through the darkness behind the courthouse. Snow muffled their footsteps. Clouds covered the moon. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The courthouse stood atop a small hill overlooking Main Street. By day it looked respectable. By night it resembled something older, something watchful. Amos had entered the building dozens of times throughout his life. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight they were not seeking justice. They were hunting it. Dalton unlocked a rear entrance. The door opened silently. They slipped inside. The building smelled of dust, paper, and old wood. Lantern light flickered across walls lined with portraits of judges long dead. Gideon moved first. Amos followed. Dalton brought up the rear. They crossed empty hallways and descended a narrow staircase into the basement. The temperature dropped noticeably. Stone walls replaced plaster. Shadows deepened. Amos felt as though they were descending into history itself. Eventually, they reached a heavy iron door. The sheriff stopped. This is it. Gideon examined the lock. Big door. Dalton nodded. Original territorial vault. Amos stared. And Beaumont has access? Apparently. Gideon inserted one of the keys. Nothing happened. He tried another, then another. Finally, the lock clicked. All three men froze. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Slowly, Gideon pulled the door open. Cold air drifted from the darkness beyond. The vault was larger than Amos expected. Shelves filled the room. Boxes, ledgers, crates. Decades of records buried beneath the courthouse. Gideon raised his lantern. Dust sparkled in the light. Start looking. They split up immediately. Amos searched one shelf, Dalton another. Gideon moved toward the oldest section. Minutes passed. Then more. Nothing. More records. More boxes. More disappointment. Amos opened crate after crate. Tax filings. Land assessments. Census reports. Everything except the registry. Hope began slipping away. Then Gideon's voice echoed through the vault. Here, Amos hurried over. Dalton followed. The marshal stood before a locked wooden chest hidden behind several crates. Unlike everything else in the room, the chest appeared recently moved. Dust patterns surrounded it. Amos felt excitement surge. "Open it." Gideon tried the lock. It refused. Dalton handed him a crowbar. Seconds later, the lid cracked open. Inside rested a collection of ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. Gideon carefully removed the first bundle. Territorial Survey Registry. Amos stopped breathing. Dalton whispered a prayer. Gideon opened the ledger. Pages filled with survey maps, property descriptions, witness signatures, and territorial seals appeared beneath the lantern light. They had found it. After 40 years of hiding, the registry existed. Real. Tangible. Powerful. Amos felt tears forming. Mary was right. Gideon nodded slowly. Yes. Then Dalton flipped several pages forward. His expression changed instantly. Wait. The marshal looked up. What? Dalton pointed. This entry. Amos leaned closer. Whitaker Covenant. Original grant. Protected territory claim. Amos recognized the name immediately. Gideon began reading aloud. Then he stopped. Silence filled the vault. The old farmer frowned. What? Gideon looked up slowly. The covenant doesn't just protect your farm. Amos stared. What do you mean? The marshal turned the ledger so both men could see. A map stretched across the page. Boundary lines covered a huge section of the county, much larger than Whitaker Farm, much larger than 27 farms. Dalton's face drained of color. Good Lord. Amos felt the room spinning slightly. How much land? Gideon measured the map with his finger. Then he looked up. Almost a third of the county. Nobody spoke. The scale of the conspiracy suddenly became clear. Beaumont hadn't stolen one farm. He hadn't stolen 27 farms. He had spent 40 years quietly stealing control of nearly an entire county. Then footsteps echoed somewhere above them. All three men froze. The sound grew louder. More footsteps joined the first. Voices followed. Amos felt ice settle in his stomach. Gideon slowly closed the ledger. Dalton extinguished one lantern. The footsteps continued, descending toward the basement. Someone had discovered they were here, and judging by the number of voices approaching, they had not come alone. The footsteps continued, descending toward the courthouse basement, each one echoing through the stone corridors like a warning bell. Amos Whitaker stood frozen beside the open chest while Gideon Hale carefully closed the Territorial Survey Registry and wrapped it back inside the oilcloth bundle. Sheriff Dalton Price extinguished the second lantern, leaving only a faint glow in the vault. The darkness thickened immediately. Above them, voices drifted down the stairwell. Too many voices. 4 at least. Maybe 5. Amos felt his pulse hammering in his chest. For a man who had spent most of his life worrying about weather and harvests, the last few days had become increasingly unbelievable. Hidden covenants, secret registries, corrupt bankers, underground archives, midnight break-ins. Now armed men were coming down into the courthouse basement. Gideon moved first. He grabbed the registry bundle and slipped it beneath his coat. Then he motioned toward the far side of the vault. Dalton nodded. The sheriff seemed to know the building better than anyone. He led them toward a narrow passage, hidden behind rows of record shelves. Amos followed quietly. The footsteps grew louder. Then came a familiar voice. Harold Beaumont, calm, confident, dangerous, search everything. Amos felt his stomach tighten. Beaumont himself had come. That could mean only one thing. He knew exactly what they were looking for. Another voice answered. Silas Crow. The registry has to be here. Gideon glanced back toward the vault entrance. His expression hardened. They were out of time. Dalton pushed against a hidden wooden panel near the back wall. To Amos's surprise, it swung inward. A maintenance corridor appeared beyond it. Move. They slipped inside. Dalton closed the panel behind them just as lantern light entered the vault. Silence followed. Amos could hear Beaumont's men searching only feet away. Boxes opened. Crates shifted. Documents scattered. Then Beaumont's voice echoed through the room. The chest. A pause followed. Then another voice spoke nervously. It's open. Silence. Heavy silence. Amos imagined the expression on Beaumont's face. He imagined the realization settling over the wealthy ranch owner. The registry was gone. Suddenly something crashed against a wall. Beaumont had lost his temper. Find them. The order carried enough fury to chill the air itself. The search intensified immediately. Amos, Gideon, and Dalton moved deeper through the maintenance corridor. The passage eventually opened into another section of the basement far from the vault. Cobwebs coated the ceiling. Dust covered everything. The corridor appeared unused for decades. Dalton finally stopped near an old boiler room. We can talk here. Amos leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Gideon removed the registry bundle from beneath his coat. The sight of it still felt unreal. 40 years of buried truth now rested in his hands. Dalton looked at the package and shook his head. I still can't believe it exists. Gideon carefully untied the wrapping. Let's make sure it contains what we think. They gathered around a workbench. Lantern light illuminated the pages. The registry was even more detailed than the journal had suggested. Survey maps stretched across entire counties. Witness signatures appeared beside original land grants. Territorial seals authenticated every entry. And page after page connected Harold Beaumont's empire to fraudulent transfers and missing claims. Amos stared at one particular section. Look, Gideon followed his finger. The entry described Whitaker Farm's original grant. But beneath it appeared something new. A handwritten amendment dated 1851. The marshal began reading aloud. In the event of dispute, ownership shall remain vested in the Whitaker family until such time as the Covenant Council reconvenes. Amos frowned. Covenant Council? Dalton looked equally confused. What's that? Gideon turned several pages. More references appeared. Different properties. Different families. Same council. I've never heard of it. Amos rubbed his forehead. Neither have I. The marshal kept reading. Then suddenly, he stopped. Silence filled the room. Dalton noticed immediately. What? Gideon slowly lifted his eyes from the page. The council never dissolved. Amos blinked. What? He pointed toward the entry. Authority remains active until all surviving signatory bloodlines are extinguished. Dalton stared. Meaning? Gideon closed the registry carefully. Meaning Beaumont never legally owned any of the land he stole. The room fell silent. Amos felt dizzy. For years he had believed his farm might be saved. Now he was learning something even larger. Beaumont's entire empire rested on fraud. Every ranch, every pasture, every acre. The realization struck like lightning. Then another sound interrupted their thoughts. A distant bell. Amos frowned. What's that? Dalton looked toward the ceiling. His face went pale. The courthouse clock. Gideon checked his pocket watch. Nearly 3 a.m. Amos suddenly understood. The auction would begin in only 6 hours. They possessed the truth. They possessed the registry. But none of it mattered if Beaumont seized Whitaker Farm before anyone could hear the evidence. Dalton seemed to reach the same conclusion. Judge Carter. Gideon nodded. We need him before sunrise. The sheriff hesitated. That won't be easy. Why? Dalton looked uncomfortable. Because Beaumont is already with him. Silence followed. Amos stared. What? I received a message before we came here. Dalton rubbed his eyes. Judge Carter called an emergency meeting tonight. Gideon's expression darkened. Why? Dalton laughed bitterly. Officially? To discuss legal concerns surrounding tomorrow's auction. Unofficially? The sheriff met his gaze. To make sure the auction still happens. Amos felt anger rising. Every path seemed blocked. Every door guarded. Every honest man pressured into obedience. Yet Gideon remained calm. Too calm. The retired marshal folded the registry and slipped it back into its wrapping. Then he stood. Good. Dalton blinked. Good? Very good. Amos frowned. Have you finally gone crazy? Gideon smiled slightly. No. He looked toward the courthouse ceiling. Beaumont thinks he's winning. Dalton stared. Isn't he? The marshal shook his head. Not anymore. He began gathering documents from the registry. Survey maps, witness pages, original claims. The most important evidence. Amos watched carefully. What are you doing? Gideon tucked the documents inside separate folders. Insurance. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Then understanding slowly appeared. You think they'll come after the registry? I know they will. Amos finally understood as well. If Beaumont learned the registry had been recovered, he would destroy it, burn it, steal it, bury it, anything to protect himself. Gideon handed one folder to Dalton, another to Amos. The remainder he kept. If we get separated, the truth survives. Silence followed. The old farmer stared at the documents in his hands. 40 years of lies reduced to a handful of papers. Yet those papers could change everything. Dalton slipped his folder beneath his coat. What now? Gideon looked toward the dark corridor leading out of the basement. Now we leave. Through the front door? Amos asked. No. Gideon smiled faintly. Through the judge's house. Dalton nearly laughed. You're serious? Completely. The sheriff shook his head. One day I'll understand how your mind works. Gideon started walking. No, you won't. They moved quietly through the hidden passages beneath the courthouse. Dalton knew routes few people remembered. Old service corridors, maintenance tunnels, forgotten staircases. The building had been expanded so many times over the decades that parts of it resembled a maze. Eventually, they emerged through a cellar entrance several blocks away. Snow continued falling across Cedar Hollow. The streets lay nearly empty. Lanterns glowed in a few windows. Somewhere a dog barked. Otherwise, the town slept. Gideon looked toward the hill where Judge Carter's home stood. Light still shone from several windows. Amos followed his gaze. They're meeting now. Gideon nodded. Exactly. Dalton exhaled slowly. This is a terrible idea. Probably. Again. Probably again. For the first time all night, Amos smiled. Only slightly. But it felt good. Then a rifle shot shattered the silence. The bullet struck the snow less than 10 feet away. All three men dropped instantly. Another shot followed. Then another. Amos heard horses approaching from the darkness. Multiple riders. Fast. Gideon looked toward the street corner and swore softly. Silhouettes emerged through the snow. Armed men. At least 6. Maybe more. And riding at the front was Silas Crow himself. The banker pulled his horse to a stop beneath a street lamp and raised his rifle. "Marshal!" he shouted. "You should have stayed in the vault." Gideon slowly drew his revolver. Snow drifted between them. The registry rested beneath his coat. The auction waited at sunrise. Beaumont waited at the judge's house. And now half the county's hired guns stood between them and the truth. For the first time since finding the family Bible, Amos realized tomorrow might not simply decide who owned Whitaker Farm. It might decide who survived long enough to tell the story. The rifle report echoed through the sleeping town, followed immediately by the pounding of hooves on frozen earth. Snow swirled beneath lantern light as Silas Crow and his riders spread across the street, cutting off every obvious route toward Judge Carter's house. Amos Whitaker dropped behind a water trough, while Gideon Hale and Sheriff Dalton Price took cover behind stacked supply crates near the alley entrance. The town around them remained dark, but curtains shifted behind windows. Cedar Hollow was waking up. Not fully. Not yet. But people had heard the shots. And in small towns, gunfire after midnight traveled faster than gossip. Crow sat confidently atop his horse, rifle balanced across the saddle. He looked less like a banker and more like a man who had finally stopped pretending. Behind him stood 6 armed riders. Hired men. Mercenaries. Men who served money instead of law. Snowflakes collected on their coats as they slowly advanced. You know, Crow called out, "This has become far more expensive than a farm." Gideon remained hidden. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. Crow smiled. Give me the registry. Come get it. One of the riders fired. The bullet shattered a lantern hanging beside the general store. Glass exploded across the street. Crow sighed. You always choose the difficult road. Gideon finally stepped partially into view, revolver in hand. And you always choose the crooked one. Another tense silence followed. Amos remained crouched low. His old bones ached from the cold, but his mind stayed sharp. Something about the situation bothered him. Crow had them surrounded. He possessed superior numbers, yet he wasn't attacking. He was stalling. Gideon seemed to realize it at the same moment. He's waiting. Dalton glanced over. For what? The marshal's eyes narrowed. Beaumont. The answer arrived seconds later. More hoofbeats echoed through the night. A second group approached from the opposite end of town. Amos peeked over the trough. His heart sank. Harold Beaumont rode at the front. Beside him traveled Judge Carter. The judge appeared deeply uncomfortable. Beaumont did not. The wealthy ranch owner brought his horse to a stop beneath a street lamp and surveyed the scene calmly. Marshal. Gideon didn't answer. Beaumont's gaze shifted toward Dalton. Sheriff. Dalton's jaw tightened. Harold. The ranch owner removed his gloves. This has gone far enough. Gideon laughed softly. Interesting choice of words. Beaumont ignored him. You have documents that belong to the county. No. Gideon shook his head. I have documents stolen from the county. Several townspeople had begun appearing along the edges of the street. Men pulling on coats, women wrapped in blankets, curious faces watching from porches. The confrontation was no longer private. Beaumont noticed immediately. His expression darkened slightly. Public attention was dangerous. Truth preferred witnesses. So did justice. Judge Carter, Beaumont said calmly, perhaps you should explain the legal consequences. The judge looked exhausted. He cleared his throat. Marshal Hale, Sheriff Price, and Mr. Whitaker are currently in possession of restricted county property obtained without authorization. Amos nearly laughed. Restricted county property, 40 years of stolen evidence reduced to a bureaucratic phrase. Gideon seemed equally unimpressed. Tell them the other part. Carter hesitated. Beaumont's eyes narrowed. Judge. The pressure was obvious. Everyone could see it. The judge shifted uneasily in his saddle. For a moment, Amos thought he would remain silent. Then something unexpected happened. Carter looked at the gathering townspeople, at the old farmer, at the sheriff. Finally at Gideon, and something changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. The documents, Carter said carefully, may also contain evidence requiring judicial review. Silence followed. Beaumont's face hardened instantly. Crow cursed under his breath. Gideon smiled. Small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The ranch owner recovered quickly. Then bring them to court tomorrow. Gideon shook his head. No. Why not? Because tomorrow morning you'll have them disappear. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Beaumont's composure slipped for the first time. Only slightly. But Amos saw it. So did everyone else. The wealthy ranch owner was no longer controlling the conversation. The truth was beginning to move on its own. Crow apparently reached the same conclusion. He suddenly raised his rifle. Enough. Every head turned. The banker pointed directly at Amos. Give us the registry. Amos slowly stood from behind the trough. Fear lingered somewhere deep inside him, but anger had long since claimed the stronger position. He looked at Crow, then at Beaumont, then at the gathering townspeople. For 40 years, Amos said quietly, you've stolen from people who trusted you. Nobody interrupted. You took farms, homes, futures. Snow drifted around him. You buried records, burned churches, bought judges, bought sheriffs. Dalton looked away. The words stung because they carried truth. Amos continued. And now you're pointing rifles at an old farmer because you're afraid of a book. The crowd murmured again. Crow's face reddened. Beaumont's eyes remained cold. Gideon watched carefully. The balance was shifting. Publicly. Visibly. Then, an elderly voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. "He's right." Everyone turned. Old Martha Jenkins stood near the bakery wrapped in a heavy shawl. Her family had lost their ranch 15 years earlier. Amos remembered. Others remembered too. Another voice followed. "They took ours too." Then another, and another. Suddenly, stories began emerging from every direction. Families ruined by debt. Land lost through suspicious claims. Properties seized after unexplained court rulings. For decades, they had suffered alone. Now they were hearing their own experiences reflected in someone else's story. The effect was powerful. Beaumont saw the danger immediately. So did Crow. Fear spread across the faces of the powerful men for the first time. Not fear of guns, fear of witnesses. Then a new voice cut through the crowd. "What's all this?" Every head turned. A wagon rolled slowly into town through the falling snow. 3 men sat inside, railroad men. Their coats bore the insignia of the Western Territorial Railway. Amos didn't recognize them. Gideon did. His eyes widened. Well now. The wagon stopped. An older man stepped down. Silver hair, thick mustache, expensive coat. Authority radiated from him naturally. Sheriff Dalton whispered, "That's William Mercer." Amos frowned. "Who?" "President of the railway." Suddenly everyone understood. Beaumont certainly did. His face went pale. Mercer approached the crowd calmly. "Judge Carter." "Mr. Mercer." The judge looked surprised. "What brings you here?" Mercer glanced around. "A telegram." Gideon smiled slightly. "Good." Crow looked confused. Beaumont did not. He knew exactly what had happened. Somewhere between finding the registry and reaching town, Gideon had sent a message. The ranch owner slowly turned toward the marshal. "You planned this." Gideon shrugged. "I planned several things." Mercer accepted a folder from one of his assistants. Then he opened it and looked directly at Beaumont. Interesting reading. Silence spread across the street. The railway president raised one of the survey maps recovered from the registry, particularly the section showing railway easements fraudulently transferred during territorial expansion. Beaumont said nothing. Crow looked sick. Judge Carter looked horrified. Mercer folded the map. "The Western Territorial Railway takes property fraud very seriously." Gideon nodded. "So I've heard." The older man looked toward the crowd. "I've also brought federal investigators." The words landed like a cannon blast. Absolute silence followed. Then panic flashed across Crow's face. Beaumont's confidence vanished completely. Even Judge Carter seemed stunned. Federal investigators. The fight had just become much larger than Cedar Hollow, much larger than a farm, much larger than a county. Crow suddenly spurred his horse forward. Gideon moved instantly. "Stop him!" Dalton drew his revolver. So did several townsmen. Crow froze. Snow swirled around the standoff. The banker looked trapped for the first time in his life. Then another sound echoed across town. Church bells. Loud, urgent, continuous. Everyone turned toward the church steeple. Amos frowned. "What's happening now?" A young boy came running down Main Street, breathless, terrified. "Fire!" he shouted. "The courthouse is on fire!" Silence shattered. Gideon felt his stomach drop instantly. The registry. The remaining evidence. The vault. Beaumont closed his eyes briefly. Just briefly. But it was enough. Gideon saw it. Dalton saw it. Amos saw it. The courthouse fire was no accident. Someone had failed to retrieve the evidence. So now they intended to destroy it. Gideon looked toward the flames beginning to glow against the night sky beyond the hill. Then he looked back at Beaumont. The ranch owner remained perfectly still. Too still. Which told the marshal everything he needed to know. The fire was only the beginning. And somewhere inside that burning courthouse, another secret was waiting to die. The courthouse fire turned Cedar Hollow into a town of running shadows. Bells rang from the church tower with frantic urgency while orange light climbed the night sky behind the courthouse hill. Men shouted from porches. Women pulled children from beds. Horses screamed in nearby stables as smoke rolled down Main Street and mixed with falling snow. For one stunned second, everyone forgot the guns. Everyone forgot the registry. Everyone forgot that Silas Crow still sat mounted beneath a street lamp with 6 armed men behind him. Fire had a way of reducing all human plans to one simple truth. If it was not stopped, everything around it would burn. Then Gideon Hale moved. Dalton, the sheriff turned. "Get people to the well line!" Dalton ran toward the center of town, shouting orders before anyone else could think. "Buckets! Wake the blacksmith! Pull water from the livery trough! Move!" His voice broke the spell. Townspeople surged into motion. Doors opened. Lanterns appeared. Men formed lines. Women dragged wet blankets from wash barrels. Even those who had been too afraid to speak against Beaumont now ran toward the flames. Fear of banks was powerful, but fear of fire reached deeper. Amos Whitaker stood gripping the folder beneath his coat, watching the blaze grow. The courthouse windows glowed from within like furnace doors. Sparks lifted into the sky. The roof had not caught fully yet, but smoke poured from the rear corner near the basement stairs. The vault. Amos felt horror rise in him. The rest of the records. Gideon nodded grimly. That's why they lit it. Silas Crow spurred his horse backward, trying to slip away while the town turned toward the fire. Gideon saw him. "Crow!" The banker froze. Gideon raised his revolver. "Get down!" Crow's hired men hesitated. With the crowd now alert and the railway men present, the balance of force had changed. William Mercer's federal investigators had drawn their weapons too. Crow looked from Gideon to Beaumont, then toward the burning courthouse. For the first time, the banker seemed unsure whose orders still mattered. Beaumont remained very still in the saddle, watching flames swallow the building that held the official remnants of his crimes. His face carried no panic, only calculation. That told Gideon enough. The fire had not been a desperate accident. It was part of a plan. Maybe the final part. "Arrest him," Gideon said. Dalton, already halfway toward the well line, turned back. "Who?" Gideon pointed at Crow. "Start with the banker." Crow raised his rifle slightly. "You have no authority." Gideon's voice dropped. "Try me." The street fell into another dangerous silence. But before Crow could decide whether to shoot, 2 federal investigators stepped forward beside Mercer. One of them spoke calmly. "I have authority." Crow's face changed. The investigator removed a folded warrant from inside his coat. "Silas Crow, you are under federal detention pending inquiry into land fraud, obstruction of records, and conspiracy involving railway easements." Crow's mouth opened, but no words came. Hired men did not die for employers already under arrest. One by one, they lowered their weapons. The banker was pulled from his horse and disarmed beneath the same street lamp where he had threatened an old farmer moments earlier. Amos watched without satisfaction. Justice had begun, but fire still roared above them. Gideon turned toward Beaumont. "Warnya." Beaumont smiled faintly. "For what? Watching a building burn?" "For arranging it. Prove it." Gideon stepped closer. "I intend to." Beaumont's smile widened with quiet cruelty. "Then you should hurry before your proof turns to ash." The words hit Amos harder than any bullet. Gideon surged forward as though he might drag Beaumont from the saddle with his own hands, but Mercer caught his arm. "Marshal!" Gideon did not take his eyes off Beaumont. "He did this." "I know." "Then arrest him." Mercer glanced toward the courthouse. "Not before we save what we can." The logic was unbearable but correct. Gideon swore and ran toward the fire. Amos followed despite his age, despite the cold, despite every ache in his body. The courthouse steps were already crowded with men forming bucket lines. Smoke poured from broken windows. Dalton stood near the entrance coughing, directing men to soak blankets and cover the front doors. "Basement stairs are burning!" someone shouted. "The vault!" Amos cried. Gideon looked at the building, then at the crowd. "Is there another way down?" Dalton coughed and shook his head, then stopped. His eyes widened. The maintenance tunnels. Gideon grabbed his arm. Where? Behind the old jail cells. Can we reach them? Maybe. Amos stepped forward. I'm coming. Gideon turned sharply. No. Yes. Amos. Those records are my family too. The old farmer's voice shook, but not with fear. And not just mine. Gideon stared at him for one long second, then nodded. Together he, Amos, Dalton, and two investigators moved around the courthouse through smoke so thick it seemed to bite. They reached the side entrance near the old jail cells, where flames had not yet spread fully. Dalton kicked the door open. Smoke rolled out. Everyone dropped low and entered. Inside, heat pressed against them like a living thing. The hallway glowed red. Boards creaked overhead. Somewhere glass shattered. Dalton led the way through the old holding area to a narrow storage room where a trapdoor sat hidden beneath sacks of lime. Gideon tore them aside. The wood was hot to the touch. He wrapped his sleeve around the handle and pulled. The tunnel below breathed out smoke, but not flame. Go. They descended quickly. The tunnel was black, choking, and narrow. Amos clutched the folder beneath his coat while coughing so hard his ribs hurt. Gideon moved ahead with a lantern covered by his sleeve. Dalton followed behind. The investigators stayed near the entrance, passing back warnings about spreading fire. They reached the maintenance corridor beneath the courthouse. Smoke curled along the ceiling. The vault door stood open in the distance. Flames flickered beyond it. Someone had set the fire inside the records room itself. Gideon's face hardened. Bastards! They rushed forward. Inside the vault, shelves burned along one wall. Papers curled into black petals. Boxes smoldered. The wooden chest that had held the Territorial Survey Registry stood open and empty. Because Gideon had taken the registry earlier, the most important document survived. But dozens of other records were burning. Evidence of stolen farms, witness ledgers, county transfer notes, histories that belonged to families now standing in the street above. Amos began grabbing documents without thinking. Gideon shouted, "Only what matters. It all matters. Then take what proves it." Dalton found the oldest ledgers near the back wall and began throwing them into a canvas sack. Gideon pulled survey bundles from a lower shelf, untouched by flame. Amos spotted a narrow iron box beneath a collapsed crate. It bore a mark he recognized from the covenant parchment. A circle around a cross. His hands trembled as he dragged it free. "Gideon!" The marshal turned. His eyes sharpened. "Bring it!" Smoke thickened. The ceiling groaned. A burning beam fell near the doorway, showering sparks across the floor. Dalton shouted, "We have to go!" Amos tried to lift the iron box, but it was too heavy. Gideon rushed over and grabbed one handle. Together they dragged it toward the exit. The heat grew unbearable. Amos's eyes watered. Every breath felt like swallowing coal dust. Another beam cracked overhead. Gideon shoved him forward. "Move!" They reached the tunnel just as part of the vault ceiling collapsed behind them. Flame exploded into the room, swallowing the shelves they had left behind. The blast threw smoke down the corridor. Amos nearly fell, but Dalton caught him. The iron box scraped across stone as they dragged it through the tunnel. By the time they reached the trapdoor, Amos could barely stand. Hands reached down from above. Investigators pulled the ledgers first, then the iron box, then Amos. He collapsed into the snow outside, coughing violently. Cold air struck his face like mercy. Around him, townspeople cheered as the courthouse roof finally began to give way inward, flames consuming the upper floors but sparing nearby buildings thanks to the bucket lines. Gideon emerged last, his coat smoking, face blackened with soot, clutching the registry beneath his arm. Dalton stumbled out behind him with the canvas sack of ledgers. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Amos looked across the street and saw Harold Beaumont watching. Not horrified, not grieving. Watching, calculating what had survived. Gideon followed his gaze. Slowly, deliberately, the retired marshal lifted the Territorial Survey Registry high enough for Beaumont to see. The ranch owner's expression changed, only slightly, but everyone watching saw it. The evidence had survived, more than survived. It had emerged from the fire in front of the whole town. Then a small voice came from the crowd. "Martha Jenkins, open the iron box." Amos looked at Gideon. The marshal nodded. Two investigators carried the box to the street. Its lock was old but intact. Dalton struck it with the butt of his revolver until the latch broke. The lid groaned open. Inside were not land records, not maps, not deeds. Instead, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with red string, lay dozens of signed statements. Gideon lifted the first one and read by lantern light. His face changed. "What is it?" Amos asked. Gideon looked at him, then at the crowd. Confessions. Silence spread outward in a wave. He read the first statement aloud. It was written by a former county clerk, admitting that Harold Beaumont had ordered territorial records altered and original claims suppressed. The second statement came from a deputy surveyor. The third from a judge's assistant. The fourth from a banker who had worked before Crow. Each named Beaumont. Each described the machinery of theft. Each confirmed that farms had been seized under false debts and forged records. By the time Gideon finished the fifth statement, the entire town stood frozen. The fire still roared behind them, but no one looked away from the papers. Amos understood then why Reverend Walker had hidden the iron box separately. The registry proved ownership. The confessions proved crime. Together, they were enough to break Beaumont. Yet the ranch owner still sat mounted, jaw clenched, eyes cold. Then Judge Carter stepped forward from the crowd. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. Ash drifted across his coat. He stared at the confessions in Gideon's hand. "I want those entered into federal custody." Beaumont turned sharply. "Carter." The judge did not look at him. "And I want the auction suspended pending emergency review." A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite a cheer. Not yet. More like a breath held for 40 years finally released. Amos closed his eyes. Whitaker Farm was not saved fully. Not yet. But it had not been sold. Not that morning. Not under lies. Gideon looked toward Beaumont. "You're running out of doors." Beaumont's face hardened. "You think a few burned papers and frightened townspeople can undo 40 years? Amos stepped forward then, soot on his face, Bible still held against his chest. His voice was quiet, but the street had gone silent enough for everyone to hear. "No." He looked at the registry, the confessions, the burned courthouse, the frightened banker in custody. The townspeople finally awake. Then he looked at Beaumont. "We think the truth can." For the first time, Harold Beaumont had no answer. By dawn, the courthouse was a smoking skeleton against a pale winter sky, its roof caved inward, its windows blackened, its proud white columns stained with soot. Cedar Hollow gathered around it in a silence deeper than morning. People stood in small groups along Main Street, wrapped in coats and blankets, faces gray from smoke and disbelief. They had watched the building burn through the night. They had passed buckets until their hands blistered. They had seen records carried from the flames, men arrested in the street, and Harold Beaumont's empire tremble for the first time in 40 years. But the town had not yet decided what to do with the truth. Truth could terrify people who had survived by avoiding it. Amos Whitaker stood near the church steps with the family Bible held against his chest, smoke still clinging to his coat. He had not slept. His eyes burned. His hands shook from exhaustion. Yet somewhere beneath the weariness, a strength he thought age had stolen returned to him. Behind him, Gideon Hale sat on the edge of a water trough while Dr. Milburn wrapped a bandage around his smoke-burned hand. The retired marshal looked older in the morning light, soot in the lines of his face, eyes reddened from the fire, but his gaze remained sharp. Sheriff Dalton Price stood beside the federal investigators, overseeing Silas Crow and 2 hired men being held near the livery. Harold Beaumont had not been arrested. Not yet. That fact hung over the town like smoke that refused to clear. William Mercer, president of the Western Territorial Railway, had insisted on a public review before taking further action. Judge Carter, shaken by the confessions recovered from the iron box, had suspended the auction, but suspension was not salvation. The land was not restored. The stolen farms were not returned. Beaumont still had money, lawyers, influence, and men willing to swear that fire, fraud, and missing records were nothing more than misunderstanding. Amos understood something now that he had not understood at sunrise the day before. Evil did not always lose when exposed. Sometimes it simply changed clothes and walked into court. The emergency hearing was moved from the burned courthouse to the church because it was the only building large enough to hold the crowd. By 8 o'clock, every pew was filled. Farmers, ranchers, widows, shopkeepers, railroad workers, former landowners, and families from neighboring settlements packed the aisles and pressed along the walls. The altar had been cleared and turned into a temporary evidence table. On it lay the family Bible, the territorial covenant, Reverend Walker's journal, the surviving survey registry, the rescued ledgers, and the iron box of confessions. The objects looked small compared to the damage they represented. Gideon stood beside Amos near the front. "You ready?" the marshal asked. Amos looked at the packed church. "No." Gideon nodded. "Good. Honest men rarely are." Judge Carter entered moments later, followed by Mercer and 2 federal investigators. The judge looked pale, but determined. When Harold Beaumont walked in, the church became utterly silent. He had changed clothes since the fire. Of course he had. His coat was clean, his boots polished, his face composed. He moved down the aisle with the calm of a man who believed appearances still had power. But this time, people did not lower their eyes. Martha Jenkins stared at him openly. So did Elias Boone, whose family had lost a ranch 20 years earlier. So did a dozen others whose names appeared in Reverend Walker's journal. Beaumont reached the front and stood near the right side aisle, refusing to sit. Judge Carter opened the hearing with a voice that trembled only once. "This emergency assembly concerns the seizure and attempted auction of Whitaker Farm, the authenticity of the Whitaker Covenant, and recovered documents suggesting widespread property fraud across Cedar Hollow County." A murmur passed through the church. Carter struck the pulpit with a small wooden gavel borrowed from the church clerk. "Order." The first evidence presented was the covenant found inside the family Bible. Gideon explained where it had been discovered, how it had been hidden in the binding, and what it stated. Amos watched faces change as the words were read aloud. The land could not be seized or transferred for private debt unless all living Whitaker heirs signed release. Since Amos had signed no release, the bank's seizure was invalid. Silas Crow, sitting under guard near the front, stared at the floor. Beaumont's expression remained unreadable. Then came Reverend Walker's journal. Gideon read selected passages describing false debt claims, missing territorial records, altered survey maps, and land transfers linked to Beaumont's agents. At the mention of each stolen farm, someone in the church reacted. A widow covered her mouth. A rancher bowed his head. An old man began to cry quietly. These were not old abstractions anymore. These were lives, homes, graves, orchards planted by dead fathers, wells dug by grandmothers, churches built by hands long buried. The room filled with grief that had waited decades for permission to speak. Then Mercer stepped forward with the railway maps. His voice was calm but carried authority. The Western Territorial Railway confirms that multiple easements referenced in these documents were unlawfully transferred through forged county filings. Some of those transfers directly benefited enterprises controlled by Harold Beaumont. Beaumont finally spoke. Alleged enterprises. Mercer looked at him. Signed enterprises. The crowd murmured. Judge Carter allowed the railway president to continue. Mercer described how altered land records had affected not only farmers but freight routes, water access, and settlement development. In other words, Beaumont had not merely stolen land. He had shaped the county around his theft. The final evidence came from the iron box. One by one, the signed confessions were read aloud. Former clerks, surveyors, deputies, bank employees, men now dead, men still living. Each statement described a different piece of the scheme. Some had taken bribes, some had falsified maps, some had hidden deeds, some had been threatened into silence. Together they formed a wall of truth no polished speech could break. Beaumont waited until the last confession was read. Then he stepped forward. "May I speak?" Judge Carter hesitated, then nodded. Briefly. Beaumont turned not to the judge, but to the crowd. He understood power flowed from perception. You've heard many old papers today, many emotional claims, many accusations from frightened people looking for someone to blame. A low murmur rose, but he continued. I did what men of vision must do. I built this county. I brought rail lines, banks, cattle contracts, jobs, growth. Without my investments, half of you would still be scratching corn from dry dirt. Anger rippled through the pews. Gideon watched him carefully. Beaumont's mask was cracking, but not from fear, from contempt. The truth had not humbled him. It had insulted him. Yes, Beaumont said, voice rising. Land changed hands. Debts were enforced. Weak farmers lost what stronger men could manage. That is not theft. That is progress. Amos felt the words strike the room like a slap. Weak farmers. Stronger men. Progress. Suddenly all the suffering in the church had a name, and that name stood proudly before them. Martha Jenkins stood. My husband died, thinking he failed his children. Beaumont looked at her coldly. Perhaps he did. The church erupted. Judge Carter shouted for order. Gideon moved instinctively toward Beaumont, but Amos caught his sleeve. Not yet. The old farmer rose slowly, Bible in hand. The room quieted by degrees. Amos walked into the center aisle. Every eye turned to him. For a moment he could barely breathe. He was not a speaker. He was not a lawyer. He was a farmer with smoke in his lungs and 72 years in his bones, but he had buried enough grief to know the sound of truth when it needed a human voice. You say weak farmers lost what stronger men could manage, Amos said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. My grandfather broke this land with bleeding hands. My father built fences with no nails because he could not afford them. My wife Mary fed hungry neighbors from our pantry when our own jars were nearly empty. My children slept beneath that roof while storms tried to tear it off. If that is weakness, then God bless weak people. Silence fell. Amos opened the family Bible. This book has names in it. Births. Marriages. Deaths. Not investments. Not profits. Lives. He looked at Beaumont. You built your county by pretending lives were numbers. Beaumont's jaw tightened. Amos continued. But land remembers. Graves remember. Families remember. And sometimes, even when men burn courthouses, hide records, and buy silence, the truth waits inside an old Bible until somebody opens it. The church remained still. Even Judge Carter looked moved. Gideon lowered his eyes briefly. Amos closed the Bible. You didn't beat weak men, Mr. Beaumont. You robbed patient ones. And now their patience is done. A sound rose from the crowd, at first soft, then stronger, a murmur of agreement, then voices, then people standing. One by one, families whose land had been stolen rose from their pews, not shouting, not rioting, standing, witnessing. Beaumont looked around and realized something had shifted beyond recovery. Fear had held the county together for 40 years. Shared truth was pulling it apart. Judge Carter struck the pulpit again, but not to silence the people, to mark the moment. Based on evidence presented, the auction of Whitaker Farm is hereby canceled pending full restoration review. A wave of emotion moved through the church. Amos closed his eyes. The first true relief of the entire ordeal nearly took his knees from under him. Carter continued, stronger now. Furthermore, all property transfers connected to the recovered registry will be suspended for federal examination. Silas Crow remains in custody. Harold Beaumont. The judge stopped. The church held its breath. Beaumont's hand moved slowly toward the inside of his coat. Gideon saw it. Don't. Beaumont froze. The marshal's revolver was already drawn. So were Dalton's and 2 federal investigators. For one long second, everything balanced on the edge of bloodshed. Then Beaumont smiled faintly and removed not a weapon but a folded document. I think you will find, he said, that I am protected by agreements reaching far above this county. He handed the document to Judge Carter. Carter read it. His face changed. Mercer took the paper next. His expression darkened. Gideon stepped closer. What is it? Mercer looked up grimly. An immunity agreement. The church erupted again. Beaumont's smile returned. As I said, progress requires friends. Amos stared at him. Horror replacing relief. After everything, after the fire, after the confessions, after the registry, Beaumont still had another wall protecting him. Gideon's face became stone. Judge Carter looked sick. Dalton cursed under his breath. Beaumont turned toward the aisle, preparing to leave. "Gentlemen, I believe this hearing has become theatrical." Then a voice came from the back of the church. "Not theatrical." Everyone turned. An elderly woman stood near the doors, leaning on a cane, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. Her hair was white, her face deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp as winter stars. Gideon's breath caught. Amos looked at him. "Who is she?" The marshal whispered. "Abigail Walker." The woman stepped forward slowly, incomplete. Beaumont's smile vanished. Judge Carter frowned. "Ma'am?" Abigail Walker lifted a leather satchel. "That immunity agreement is incomplete." Beaumont went pale. For the first time all morning, real fear entered his face. Abigail Walker continued down the aisle. "My husband, Reverend Thomas Walker, kept the final page." She stopped before the altar and placed the satchel beside the family Bible. "And Harold Beaumont has spent 40 years praying no one would find me alive." Abigail Walker walked down the church aisle slowly, but each step seemed to strike harder than any gavel. The crowd parted without being asked. Men who had faced prairie storms, cattle stampedes, bank collectors, and hired guns lowered their voices as the widow of Reverend Thomas Walker approached the altar. She was smaller than Amos Whitaker expected, bent slightly with age, her white hair pinned beneath a dark bonnet, one gloved hand gripping a cane, the other holding a worn leather satchel against her side. Yet something in her face made even Harold Beaumont step back. Not fear of her body, fear of what she carried. Gideon Hale stood utterly still near the front pew, his revolver lowered but not holstered. "Abigail," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Gideon." For a moment, the years between them filled the church with things unspoken. Old grief, old duty, old promises. Then she turned toward Judge Carter. "That immunity agreement is incomplete." Beaumont recovered enough to laugh. "An old woman's claim does not undo federal arrangement." Abigail did not look at him. "No. But the missing page does." She placed the satchel on the altar beside the family Bible and opened it carefully. The church leaned forward as one body. From inside, she removed a folded oilcloth packet tied with faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from uncertainty, from age, from memory, from carrying a burden too long. Judge Carter stepped closer. "Mrs. Walker, where did you obtain this?" "My husband gave it to me before he died." Her voice was thin, but clear. "He said if Harold Beaumont ever tried to hide behind mercy he did not deserve, I was to bring this forward." Beaumont's face hardened. "This is absurd." Abigail finally turned to him. "You always said that when truth entered the room." The crowd murmured. Judge Carter untied the ribbon and unfolded the packet. Inside was the final page of the immunity agreement, along with a sworn statement written by Reverend Thomas Walker. Carter read silently at first. Then his face changed. "Dear God." Mercer stepped beside him. "May I?" The judge handed him the papers. The railway president read quickly, expression darkening with each line. Gideon watched both men. "What does it say?" Carter looked up. The immunity agreement was conditional. Beaumont's jaw clenched. Mercer continued. Protection applied only if Harold Beaumont disclosed all land interests, surrendered altered records, and provided testimony against lower-level participants. Dalton Price spoke from the front aisle. "Did he?" Abigail answered before anyone else could. "No." She pulled another document from the satchel. "My husband kept a list of what Beaumont concealed." Gideon took the page and read it. The list was devastating. Hidden companies, secret holdings, bribed clerks, murdered witnesses, burned records, threatened families. At the bottom appeared one final note in Reverend Walker's handwriting. Harold Beaumont never sought immunity from guilt. He sought permission to keep the fruit of it. Silence fell so completely that Amos could hear the church lamps hiss. Beaumont's face had gone pale, but rage quickly replaced shock. Thomas Walker was a liar. Abigail lifted her chin. "My husband was many things. Stubborn, proud, too trusting for too long. But he was never a liar. He was obsessed. Because he carried the names of the dead you stepped over. Beaumont turned toward Judge Carter. You cannot accept hidden documents without proper authentication. Mercer held up the page. The federal seal is intact. Then it was stolen. Abigail's eyes flashed. No, Harold. Saved. The word settled into the church with quiet force. Saved. That was what the old Bible had done, what Reverend Walker's chamber had done, what Gideon had done by dragging the registry from the vault, what Amos had done by refusing to surrender. Saved. Not merely papers, but memory. Beaumont looked around the church and seemed to realize the room no longer belonged to him. The judge did not belong to him. The sheriff did not belong to him. The townspeople did not belong to him. Fear was loosening its grip, and without fear his wealth looked suddenly smaller. Judge Carter straightened. Harold Beaumont, based on this evidence, your claimed immunity is suspended pending federal review. Beaumont's voice became dangerously soft. You would regret that. Carter swallowed, but did not look away. Perhaps, but I would regret silence more. Gideon allowed himself the faintest smile. Dalton Price moved closer with handcuffs. Mr. Beaumont. Beaumont turned toward the sheriff with contempt. Do not touch me. Dalton stopped only a pace away. For years he had enforced orders written by men like Beaumont. He had served notices, seized animals, stood beside bank wagons, and told himself the law was the law. But now, in front of the entire town, he reached for Beaumont's wrist. Harold Beaumont, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and suspected involvement in witness intimidation and records destruction. Beaumont moved suddenly, faster than anyone expected from a man his age. He shoved Dalton backward and drew a small pistol from inside his coat. Screams burst through the church. Gideon raised his revolver instantly. Federal investigators drew their weapons. Abigail Walker stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the man who had haunted her life for decades. Beaumont backed toward the side aisle, pistol sweeping across the crowd. All of you, he snarled, owe your lives to what I built. Gideon's voice was calm. Put it down. This county was nothing before me. Amos stepped forward before Gideon could stop him, Bible held in both hands. Then maybe nothing was better than stolen. Beaumont's eyes locked on him. You. He pointed the pistol toward Amos. This began because an old farmer couldn't accept losing. Amos did not move. Fear shook his body, but his feet remained planted. No, he said. This began because thieves forgot old people, remember? Beaumont's finger tightened. Gideon fired first. The shot cracked through the church like lightning. Beaumont's pistol flew from his hand, struck by the marshal's bullet. Dalton lunged and tackled him into the aisle. The church erupted into chaos. Federal investigators rushed forward. Beaumont fought wildly, cursing, striking, trying to rise, but the room that had once feared him now surged against him. Men grabbed his arms. Dalton locked the cuffs around his wrists. Gideon stood over him, revolver still smoking. Beaumont looked up from the floor, hatred twisting his face. You think this ends me? Gideon's voice was cold. No, your own papers do. The crowd slowly quieted. Abigail Walker sank into a pew, exhausted but composed. Amos hurried to her side. Ma'am. She looked at him kindly. Mary hoped you would find the Bible page. Amos froze. You knew Mary? Abigail nodded. She came to me 5 years before she died. The old farmer's throat tightened. She never told me. She was afraid telling you would put you in danger. Abigail touched the Bible cover gently. She was braver than she let people know. Tears filled Amos's eyes. The thought of Mary carrying this secret alone nearly broke him, yet it also warmed something in him. She had not given up, not even when illness came, not even when the bank circled. She had trusted that someday, somehow, the Bible would speak. Judge Carter ordered Beaumont removed under federal guard. As the ranch owner was dragged down the aisle, the people of Cedar Hollow did not cheer. The moment was too heavy for cheering. Instead, they watched silently as a man who had bent their county for 40 years was taken past the families he had broken. Martha Jenkins stood as he passed. Elias Boone stood. Others followed. One by one, the victims rose not to honor him, but to witness his fall. Beaumont did not look at them. Men like him could face guns more easily than faces. After he was gone, Judge Carter returned to the altar. His voice shook, but this time with conviction. The auction of Whitaker Farm is permanently canceled. Amos closed his eyes. The words landed softly, almost too softly for what they meant. Carter continued, "All claims against Whitaker Farm are void pending restoration of covenant protections. Additionally, all properties named in the Territorial Survey Registry and Reverend Walker's records will be placed under immediate federal review." The church erupted then not in wild celebration, but in something deeper. Relief, grief, hope. People wept openly. Neighbors embraced. Families who had spent years believing they failed began to understand they had been robbed. Shame lifted from shoulders across the room. Amos stood motionless with the family Bible against his chest. Gideon stepped beside him. "You still standing?" Amos laughed through tears. "Barely. That's enough." Abigail Walker rose again, leaning on her cane. She looked at the Bible, then at Amos. "Your Mary once told me she believed land was not just dirt." Amos nodded, unable to speak. "She said land is where promises learn to grow roots." The words undid him. Amos bowed his head, and for the first time since Mary's funeral, he allowed himself to weep without shame. Gideon placed a hand on his shoulder. Outside, the burned courthouse still smoked against the morning sky. The town remained wounded. Records were lost. Lives had been broken. Justice would take months, maybe years, to untangle every theft. But something irreversible had happened inside that church. Fear had been named. Power had been challenged. Truth had survived fire, banks, guns, and time. And Whitaker Farm, the land Amos thought he had lost forever, was finally breathing again beneath the winter sun. The days following Harold Beaumont's arrest changed Cedar Hollow more than the previous 40 years combined. Winter still gripped the county. Snow still covered the fields. The burned courthouse still stood black and broken against the horizon. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, people spoke openly. Farmers compared old debt notices. Widows brought forgotten deeds from trunks and cupboards. Railroad workers delivered records previously ignored. Families who had spent years believing their losses were personal failures began discovering they were pieces of a larger theft. Every day, another story surfaced. Every day, another lie unraveled. And every day, the shadow Harold Beaumont had cast across the county grew smaller. 3 weeks after the hearing, federal investigators established temporary offices inside the old schoolhouse. The building once used to teach children now served as a place where adults came to reclaim stolen histories. Lines stretched down the road each morning. Men carried faded land grants. Women brought letters from dead husbands. Elderly farmers arrived clutching documents they had nearly thrown away years earlier. Many left in tears, not because everything had been fixed, because someone was finally listening. Amos Whitaker watched it happen from a distance. His farm had been saved, but the victory felt different than he once imagined. He had expected relief. Instead, he felt responsibility. Whitaker Farm had become a symbol. People stopped him in town. They shook his hand. They thanked him. Some called him brave. Amos disliked that word. Brave suggested he had known what he was doing. The truth was simpler. He had merely refused to let go of a Bible. Most mornings he returned to the fields before sunrise. Winter wheat stretched beneath frost. The fences needed repair. The barn roof still leaked. The cattle still required feeding. In many ways, farm life had not changed at all, and Amos found comfort in that. Land cared little for politics. It demanded the same labor whether men were honest or corrupt. One cold morning, Gideon Hale arrived at the farm, carrying a folded newspaper beneath his arm. The retired marshal found Amos repairing a gate near the north pasture. "You ever take a day off?" Gideon asked. Amos hammered another nail into place. "You ever stop asking that?" Gideon smiled and handed him the newspaper. The headline filled half the front page. Federal grand jury opens investigation into county land fraud. Amos read silently, then longer articles, then names. Crow, Beaumont, former commissioners, surveyors, clerks, judges. The list seemed endless. He handed the paper back. About time. Gideon leaned against the fence. You know Beaumont tried to make bail. Amos laughed. Let me guess. Denied. The old farmer nodded approvingly. Good judge. Federal judge. Amos laughed harder. The sound echoed across the frosted pasture. For a few moments neither man spoke. They simply watched the sunrise spread across the land. Then Gideon became unusually serious. There's something else. Amos immediately noticed the change. What? The marshal removed another folded document from inside his coat. Property review findings. Amos accepted it cautiously. The report summarized the first phase of the federal investigation. Survey comparisons. Ownership disputes. Historical claims. Restorations. Then he reached the final page. His eyes widened. This can't be right. Gideon nodded slowly. We checked it 3 times. Amos looked up. A third of the county? Almost. The original territorial covenant system had protected far more land than anyone realized. Beaumont's fraud had expanded over decades because most families never knew those protections existed. Now federal investigators were recommending the restoration of dozens of claims. Some families would regain land. Others would receive compensation. Several settlements might be redrawn entirely. Amos sat down on the fence rail. The scale remained difficult to understand. One hidden Bible page had exposed an entire county's corruption. Gideon seemed to read his thoughts. Mary started all this. Amos looked toward the farmhouse. Yeah, you miss her. It wasn't a question. Amos stared across the fields. Every day, silence followed. The kind of silence shared only between old men who understood loss. Finally, Gideon spoke again. She'd be proud of you. Amos looked down. Maybe. No maybe about it, the marshal pushed away from the fence. She trusted you to finish something she couldn't. Those words stayed with Amos long after Gideon left. That evening he carried the family Bible to Mary's grave beneath the cottonwood tree overlooking the western field. Snow covered the ground around the marker. Wind whispered through bare branches overhead. The farm stretched below like a memory made real. Amos sat beside the grave and placed the Bible across his knees. For a long time he simply looked at the stone. Then he began talking. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just as though Mary were sitting beside him after supper. He told her about the hearing. About Abigail Walker. About the registry. About the confessions. About Beaumont's arrest. About Gideon pretending he wasn't sentimental. About Martha Jenkins laughing. For the first time in years. About children playing outside the schoolhouse while their parents reclaimed lost records inside. He told her everything. The sky darkened slowly. Stars appeared, one by one. When he finally stopped speaking, he realized he felt lighter. Not healed. Some wounds never vanished. But lighter. As though carrying the story had become easier because he shared it. 2 days later, another surprise arrived. Sheriff Dalton Price rode onto the farm shortly before noon, except he wasn't sheriff anymore. Amos noticed immediately. No badge. No county star. Dalton seemed oddly uncomfortable. Lose something? Amos asked. Dalton rolled his eyes. Very funny. Gideon, who happened to be visiting, laughed openly. You quit. Resigned. Same thing. Dalton dismounted and handed Amos a sealed envelope. Federal office wants you to attend a meeting tomorrow. Amos frowned. What kind of meeting? Restoration Council? Gideon raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Dalton nodded. The government wants local representation while property claims get sorted out. Amos looked suspiciously at the envelope. Why me? Dalton and Gideon exchanged a glance. That immediately worried him. Why me? He repeated. Dalton shrugged. Because nobody trusts politicians. And? Gideon smiled. Everybody trusts farmers. Amos groaned. Absolutely not. The marshal laughed. Too late. The next afternoon, Amos found himself sitting inside the church alongside federal officials, railroad representatives, land surveyors, and community members. He disliked every second of it. Public meetings were exhausting. Yet as discussions continued, he began noticing something important. People listened to him, not because he was educated, not because he held office, because he understood what land meant. Numbers mattered, surveys mattered, law mattered, but homes mattered too. Families mattered, memory mattered, and surprisingly, those perspectives proved useful. By evening, the council had established procedures for reviewing claims fairly. When the meeting ended, Martha Jenkins approached Amos near the church doors. She carried a folded document with trembling hands. They found it. Amos smiled. Found what? Tears filled her eyes. My husband's original deed. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Martha hugged him unexpectedly. Amos stood awkwardly while the elderly widow cried against his shoulder. Around them, similar scenes unfolded throughout the church. Lost claims, restored names, returned histories. Not every family would receive land back. Some properties had changed too much. Some heirs had moved away. Some records remained lost forever. But justice, imperfect as it was, had finally begun moving. Later that night, Gideon and Amos stood outside the church watching townspeople leave. Lantern light reflected off snow-covered streets. Children's laughter drifted through the cold air. The county remained wounded, yet hope lived here again. You know, Gideon said quietly, there's still one thing I don't understand. Amos looked at him. What's that? How Mary knew. Amos glanced toward the family Bible beneath his arm. Maybe she trusted old books more than powerful men. Gideon laughed softly. Smart woman. Amos nodded. Very. The church doors opened behind them. Abigail Walker stepped outside, wrapped in a heavy coat. Though age bent her shoulders, something about her seemed stronger now, lighter, like a person who had finally set down a burden carried too long. She joined them near the steps. Reverend Walker would have liked this. Gideon smiled, probably would have complained first. Abigail laughed, definitely. Together they looked across Cedar Hollow. The burned courthouse still stood at the far end of town. Workers would soon tear it down and build something new. Yet none of them saw ruin anymore. They saw proof. Proof that buildings could burn while truth survived. Proof that corruption could grow for decades and still be defeated. Proof that promises written long ago could reach across generations and protect the living. As night settled over the valley, Amos held the family Bible a little tighter. The story was not finished yet. Federal trials remained ahead. Land claims remained unresolved. New battles waited beyond the horizon. But for the first time since the auction notice appeared on his porch, Amos Whitaker believed the ending would belong to honest people, and somewhere beyond the stars he hoped Mary believed it too. Spring arrived slowly in Cedar Hollow, as though the land itself wanted time to believe the long winter was truly over. Snow retreated from the hills in patches. The river broke free from ice and carried cold mountain water through the valley once more. Green returned to the pastures. Wheat fields awakened beneath warmer sunlight. Birds nested again beneath barn roofs. Life, patient as ever, resumed its work. Nearly 6 months had passed since the day Amos Whitaker stood on his porch and watched a bank nail an auction notice to his home. 6 months since Gideon Hale opened the family Bible. 6 months since a forgotten covenant, a hidden registry, and an old promise buried between generations changed the future of an entire county. Much had happened since then. Federal trials filled newspapers across 3 states. Harold Beaumont's empire collapsed piece by piece. His companies were dismantled. Hidden accounts were uncovered. Former associates testified in exchange for leniency. Some went to prison. Others disappeared from public life entirely. Silas Crow was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Several county officials lost their positions. A handful faced charges of their own. But the greatest changes never appeared in newspapers. They happened quietly across the land. Families reclaimed deeds. Boundary markers were restored. Stolen claims were corrected. Not every wrong could be undone. Some farms had changed hands too many times. Some heirs had died without seeing justice. Some wounds remained too old to heal completely. Yet the county had begun trying, and sometimes trying was the first miracle. Amos stood beside a newly repaired fence on a bright April morning and watched children run through the western pasture. Their laughter drifted across the fields. The sight still surprised him. For years, Whitaker Farm had felt smaller, lonelier, a place occupied by memory rather than possibility. Now it seemed alive again. Part of that change came from the families who visited regularly. Martha Jenkins often brought pies she claimed were too large for one person. The Boone family helped repair the south barn. Railroad workers stopped by when passing through the county. Former landowners gathered on weekends beneath the cottonwood tree to share stories while restoration cases continued. But the greatest change came from the children. There were always children now. Orphans from neighboring settlements. Sons and daughters of struggling farmers. Grandchildren of families reclaiming old claims. They treated Whitaker Farm as though it belonged to everyone. Amos pretended to complain about it. Secretly, he loved every minute. Near midday, Gideon Hale rode through the gate carrying a small wooden box beneath one arm. The retired marshal looked healthier than he had in years. The county's burdens no longer rested entirely on his shoulders. "You're late," Amos called. Gideon dismounted. "You're old." "That's not an excuse." "Worked for you," Amos laughed. The exchange felt familiar now. Comfortable. Like family. Gideon handed him the box. "What's this?" "Open it." Amos lifted the lid. Inside rested a polished brass plaque mounted on walnut wood. He read the inscription slowly. Whitaker Farm, protected under the original covenant of 1849, restored by order of the County Restoration Council. Beneath the inscription appeared dozens of signatures. Judge Carter, William Mercer, federal investigators, Restoration Council members, community representatives, and one final signature, Abigail Walker. Amos stared silently for several moments. "You did this?" Gideon shrugged. "The council did. You organized it." "Maybe?" Amos traced the lettering with one finger. For a moment he could not speak. The plaque was not valuable. It was not legal proof. It changed nothing officially. Yet somehow it meant more than many of the documents that had passed through federal courts. It represented recognition, memory, a promise that the story would not disappear again. "Thank you," Amos finally said. Gideon nodded once. Nothing more needed saying. That afternoon, people began arriving at the farm. More than usual. Wagons rolled through the gate. Riders appeared from neighboring towns. Families carried baskets and blankets. Children raced through the grass. Amos soon discovered why. Martha Jenkins had apparently organized a celebration without asking permission. "You needed one," she informed him. "I wasn't consulted." Exactly. By sunset, nearly the entire community had gathered beneath the cottonwood tree overlooking the western field. Long tables stretched across the grass. Food covered every surface. Musicians played near the barn. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Amos stood slightly apart from the crowd at first, overwhelmed by the sight. 6 months earlier, many of these people had been strangers united only by fear. Now they shared something different, not perfection, not agreement. Community. Judge Carter arrived shortly before dusk, carrying a stack of completed restoration certificates. He spent an hour handing them to families whose claims had finally been resolved. Some cried. Some laughed. Some simply stood holding papers they never expected to see again. William Mercer attended as well. So did federal investigators. So did Dalton Price, who had somehow become busier after resigning than he ever was as sheriff. Even Abigail Walker came, though age limited her travel. When she arrived, the crowd parted respectfully. The old widow carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She found Amos near the cottonwood tree. "I have something for you." Amos accepted the bundle carefully. Inside rested Reverend Walker's personal journal. Not the evidence journal. Another one. Older. More personal. "I can't take this." Abigail smiled. "You can." "Why?" She looked toward the family Bible resting on a nearby table. "Because some stories belong together." Tears filled Amos's eyes unexpectedly. Abigail placed a hand on his arm. Thomas believed history survives when ordinary people protect it. She glanced toward the crowd. Turns out he was right. As darkness settled over the farm, lanterns were lit throughout the celebration. Golden light spread across fields that once seemed destined for auction. Music floated beneath the stars. Children chased fireflies. Neighbors shared meals. And for the first time in many years, Cedar Hollow felt like a place healing instead of hiding. Later that evening, Judge Carter climbed onto a wagon and cleared his throat. The crowd gradually quieted. I won't make a long speech. Several people laughed because everyone knew he would. The judge smiled. 6 months ago, this county nearly lost itself. Silence settled gently over the gathering. We believed records mattered more than people. We believed power mattered more than truth. We believed fear was safer than honesty. He paused. We were wrong. The crowd listened. One old farmer refused to surrender his home. One retired marshal refused to stop asking questions. One woman protected a secret inside a Bible. One preacher preserved evidence when no one else would, and because of that, an entire county remembered who it was supposed to be. Applause spread through the gathering. Amos looked down, embarrassed. Gideon looked equally uncomfortable. Martha Jenkins enjoyed their discomfort immensely. The judge raised a final document. By unanimous vote of the Restoration Council, Whitaker Farm is hereby recognized as a protected historical homestead. More applause followed. Amos accepted the framed certificate while wishing very much to disappear into the wheat field. Eventually, the celebration continued. Music returned. Conversations resumed. The stars brightened overhead. Near midnight, after most guests had departed, Amos walked alone to Mary's grave beneath the cottonwood tree. He carried the family Bible in one hand and the restoration certificate in the other. The farm lay quiet behind him. Lanterns glowed faintly near the house. Crickets sang in the grass. The night felt peaceful. He sat beside the grave and placed the Bible on his lap. For a long time he said nothing. Then he smiled. You were right. The wind stirred softly through the branches. Again, he laughed quietly. I should have known. The old farmer looked across the moonlit fields. The land stretched toward the horizon exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. Not because the farm had been saved, because the people had been saved with it. Memory had survived. Truth had survived. Promises had survived. He opened the family Bible one final time. The covenant remained tucked safely inside. Names filled the pages. Births, marriages, deaths, lives. The story of a family written across generations. Then Amos carefully added one new entry beneath the others. Spring, 1891. Whitaker Farm restored. Justice returned. Promise kept. He closed the book and rested his hand upon the cover. Above him, stars filled the sky. Around him, the land breathed quietly beneath the night. And somewhere deep within the valley, beyond the fields, beyond the river, beyond the rebuilt hopes of Cedar Hollow, the future waited. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. For the first time in many years, that was enough. The end. As the lanterns slowly dim across Whitaker Farm and the night settles over Cedar Hollow, we're reminded that the strongest things in life are often the things we cannot see. A promise kept across generations. A truth hidden inside an old Bible. A community finding the courage to stand together after years of fear. If Amos Whitaker's journey touched your heart tonight, take a moment to leave a comment and tell us which part of this story moved you the most. Was it Mary's hidden sacrifice? Gideon's unwavering loyalty? Abigail Walker's final revelation? Or the moment justice finally returned to the people who had waited decades for it? Stories like these remind us that kindness is never wasted, courage is never forgotten, and the truth has a way of finding its way home. If you enjoy heartfelt Western stories filled with hope, family, redemption, and the enduring spirit of the American frontier, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey. There are many more forgotten towns, hidden secrets, lonely cowboys, brave widows, and lost families waiting to share their stories. Until next time, keep your faith strong, keep your heart open, and remember, sometimes the smallest promise can change generations. Good night, friends, and we'll see you in the next Cowboy Story.